Greetings and salutations, folks, and welcome once again, as always, to another helping of Mr H's Hot Pot. You join me today on this grey and miserable All Hallows Eve, about to go on a bit of an adventure. So, without further ado, let's jump in the old jalopy and do this, shall we? So folks, today's little adventure will take us to the rather picturesque village of Woodplumpton, which lies about 5 miles north of Preston in Lancashire. And I'm going to be visiting today, with it being Halloween, St Anne's churchyard, where there's an alleged witch's grave in that particular churchyard. Now that in itself is rather unusual, because you don't normally see a witch's grave because they was buried in unconsecrated ground. The only exception to this rule that I know of in the northwest is the grave of Alice Nutter, and she was accused of witchcraft in the 1600s, and she is actually buried in a churchyard in the Pendle area. But other than that, I do not know of any other witches' graves. If you do know of one in the northwest, why not drop a comment below, and who knows, maybe in the future we'll go and visit it. But today we're going to be visiting the Woodplumpton Witch Meg Shelton's grave, and she's been known by many different names: the Filed Witch, more disparaging the Filed Hag, and it's even some debate over her actual name. Some say that her name is Meg Shelton, others say it was Marjorie Hilton, but on her grave it actually says Meg Shelton, so we'll run with that particular name. Anyway, why not turn the lights down low, draw up a chair, and join me if you dare, as we go and visit the grave of Meg Shelton. Well folks, 40 minutes later and a quick drive up the old motorway, and I'm now in Woodplumpton, and I'm stood outside St Anne's Church and Churchyard, which is where the Woodplumpton Witch Meg Shelton is buried. Now the church that you can see in front of you dates from around 1630, although there's been many additions and many renovations made to the church down the centuries to what you see today. There's also a number of interesting little features associated with this church that I'll be taking a look at as we make our way around to Meg Shelton's grave. One of those interesting features is that Lich Gate there that you can see in front of you. That dates from around the 18th century, and just to the left of that is the village stocks, which also date from the 18th century. I'm going to try and negotiate this traffic and make my way across the road so we can take a closer look at the village stocks. It's sod's law that the minute you break out a camera and tripod, the traffic starts coming past, but I'm going to make my way across the road when it's safe, and join me on the other side and we'll take a closer look at the village stocks. So with that little bit of traffic and the road behind me safely negotiated, I'm now stood in front of what was once the village stocks here in Woodplumpton. Now these stocks date from about the 18th century, I believe, and I also believe that these are in their original position, and the reason for that is it would make perfect sense to place the stocks by the church, because the church back in the day would have been the focal point for the village. Now if you take a close look at the right hand pillar of the stocks, you'll notice that there's the initials AB carved into it. Now I'll hold my hands up here, hot potters, and I'll admit I've no idea what those initials stand for. So if anybody from Woodplumpton is watching this video, or you know more about this area than I do, and you know what those initials stand for, please leave a comment below and let me know what they stand for. Over on the left hand side, it looks like that pillar is looking a little bit worse for wear, and time hasn't been kind to it, as there's a huge crack at the bottom there, and it looks like somebody has done a bit of remedial work at some point and they've knocked an iron spike into the ground to try and stop it from toppling over. Now the wooden portion at the bottom, which would have shattered the ankles of transgressors and ne'er-do-wells back in the day, I think that's a reproduction. I don't think that's original. Now at the back, those curious stone steps, what those are, again, they're from the 18th century, and they're what is known as a mounting block. And what would have happened is, anyone who came to church on horseback, which would have been your gentry and those who had quite a bit of money, they would have come on horseback to show the status. And to preserve the dignity a little bit, they would use these mounting blocks, which would allow them to get off and onto the horse with a little bit of dignity and a little bit of grace, and that's the idea of the mounting block. So those are interesting little features of this church. Anyway, I'm now going to make my way around to the Lich Gate, and we'll take a little look at that, and then we'll make our way into the churchyard and onto Meg Shelton's grave. I'm now about to enter into the churchyard itself, and as I pass by the Lich Gate I thought I'd just briefly pause for a moment and show you the notice board which displays all the various services and at what times those services take place here at St Anne's Church in Woodplumpton. Now, what is interesting about this notice board is that it would appear that since it was originally painted, that the vicar who would have been the incumbent vicar when this was originally painted has since moved on, as they've blanked his or her name out with a bit of black masking tape there. I've no idea what's happened to that particular vicar, whether or not they've moved on to another church in another area. Who knows? Again, if you happen to come from Woodplumpton and you're watching this video, or you know more about the area than I do, and you know what's happened to that vicar, then please leave your comments below. Anyway, I'm now going to enter into the churchyard itself, and I'm going to enter not through the Lich Gate but via that little wicket style gate that you can see just to the right hand side of the Lich Gate and behind that notice board. So join me in the actual churchyard. Now, as I slowly make my way along this footpath, which is a little bit slippy underfoot today, hot potters, because it's been raining, and it leads past the church and towards the area where Meg Shelton is buried, I want to show you another little interesting feature which is associated with this church and is located on the church wall in between these two windows. I'll just lift the camera up now and you should be able to see it. And with a bit of luck you should now be able to see a large sundial which has been carved into the stonework on the side of this church in between those two windows. Now, above the sundial there is a Latin phrase which you can probably just make out there, and I'll try and pronounce it for you now, which hopefully I won't butcher it too badly, and it reads Sic transit gloria mundi, and what that translates into English as is basically thus passes away earthly glory. Now, to me that sounds very Victorian-esque in style, as the Victorians were very keen to impress on people that they needed to be humble during the life here on earth. So I would hazard a guess that both that phrase and the sundial, or to give it its correct name, mass or scratch dial, was carved into that wall during the Victorian era. Now, the purpose of these scratch or mass dials was to let both the congregation and the priest or vicar know what time it was, so they wouldn't miss mass or any other service that was being held at the church. Now, all I can say, hot potters, is that they must have got a lot more sun way back when than we get today, because today is a very grey and miserable day, as you can see in this video, and that mass or scratch dial would be next to useless if we're being honest. Anyway, I'm now going to move on and I'll show you another couple of interesting features associated with this church, and then we'll get to the main event, which is making our way over to Meg Shelton's grave, the Woodplumpton Witch. So that's another interesting little feature of this church here at Woodplumpton. Now, as we continue along the footpath, you should be able to see the grave of Meg Shelton just in the distance there on the left hand side of the footpath. We're not going to go there just yet. We're going to turn immediately right, follow the footpath around, and if we look up we should be able to see two other interesting features of this church, one at the bottom and one at the top of that bell tower. Now, interestingly, there's a second mass or scratch dial on St Anne's Church here at Woodplumpton, and it's just below the bell tower, high up on the wall to the rear of the church. Now, this feature is easily missed by people visiting this church simply because it is so high up, and it does look like it's part of the church, although it doesn't appear from the stonework around it to be an original feature when this church was built in 1630. Now, whether or not this was the first mass or scratch dial to be placed on this church, and the one that we've just taken a look at earlier replaced it or not, who knows. But it would appear that the congregation here in Woodplumpton had a problem with timekeeping, and that's why the clergy felt the need to place so many scratch or mass dials on this church. Now, I'm going to take a look at the weather vane before we move on to Meg Shelton's grave, because it is an unusual weather vane that sits on top of this bell tower, but I'm going to have to step back from the church so that I can get it into shot for you. So I'm going to do that now, and then we will finally move on to Meg Shelton's grave. And this is a better view of that unusual weather vane that sits on top of the bell tower of this church here in Woodplumpton. Now, it's unusual for the fact that it's in the shape of a fish, and I've got to be honest with you, I've never seen a church weather vane in the shape of a fish before, and I've no idea what it's meant to represent. Whether or not it's meant to represent born again Christianity or not, I've no idea. So I'm going to throw it open once again. So if you live in the village of Woodplumpton and you're watching this video, or you know more of the history on this area, especially this church here, then please leave me a comment below, as I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, we're going to move on now and continue on our way and make our way to the grave of Meg Shelton, because I do know that I've been teasing you throughout this video. So I'm now going to leave the interesting features of St Anne's Church behind us as we slowly make our way along the footpath and past this rather ornate tomb to our left with all the wrought ironwork, and slowly approach the final resting place of the Woodplumpton Witch Meg Shelton, which lies beneath this boulder. Okay folks, so here it is. This is the final resting place of local woman Meg Shelton, who's gone by many different names throughout the centuries. She's been known as the Woodplumpton Witch, the Singleton Witch, the Filed Witch, and more disparagingly, as I said earlier in this video, the Filed Hag. Now, she lived in an isolated cottage on the Fylde in the late 17th century, where she gained a reputation locally as being a powerful and very malevolent witch. She was blamed by local farmers and villagers for causing illness amongst their cattle. They also claimed that she would drain whole herds dry of their milk overnight, the stolen milk being carried off in a milking pail that she'd enchanted into the form of a goose. She was also said to be able to take the form of various animals. One farmer even claimed that he caught her spying on him in the form of a sack of grain, after the sack screamed and bled after he impaled it with a pitchfork. Now, Meg was found dead in her isolated home in 1705, crushed between an heavy oak barrel and one of the stone walls. And the locals, rather than investigate these strange circumstances, they simply put it down to the fact that she'd been dealing with the devil in return for her magical abilities, and that finally the devil had come back to claim the soul that was owed him, and they just wrote it off and left it at that, and brought her here and buried her. Now, I'm going to take a closer look at the little plaque that's in front of Meg Shelton's grave, because that's a recent addition and it wasn't there originally, and then we'll have a little talk about the manner of Meg Shelton's burial, because it is rather unusual. And the little plaque simply reads, "The Witch's Grave. Beneath this stone lie the remains of Meg Shelton, alleged witch of Woodplumpton, buried in 1705. Now, that little plaque is a recent addition, because as was the tradition when burying witches, the grave was unmarked, so for centuries Meg Shelton's grave was just marked simply by this large boulder and nothing else. Now, this is where the story and legend of Meg Shelton really starts to get strange and begins to kick in hot potters. As whilst Meg Shelton was an alleged witch in these parts at the time that she died, she hadn't actually been convicted of witchcraft, which was still punishable by death in this country, and coupled with the fact that she'd been baptised as an infant meant that she was entitled to a Christian burial in this churchyard. Now, I've no doubt that this probably upset some of the locals at the time, and may not have even sat well with the church itself, but she was entitled to a Christian burial, and that took place by the villagers on the 2nd of May 1705 under the cover of darkness, as was the tradition when burying alleged witches. However, the following morning Meg's grave was found to have been reopened, with Meg's remains lying close by on the grass in the morning dew. So once again, the following evening, and once again under the cover of darkness, the villagers set to reburying Meg Shelton in her grave, only to find her remains disturbed again the following morning. And this went on for a couple of days, with a local priest even being summoned from the nearby Cotton Hall to bless and consecrate Meg's grave, in the hope that her soul would finally be laid to rest. But the following morning, Meg was found once again to be out of her grave. So it was decided that they needed to trick Meg, and rather than bury her in the traditional manner, they instead dug a deep shaft into her grave and placed her remains head first into the shaft, with her feet facing the surface, so that should she try to claw her way out again, she would instead claw her way deeper into the earth. But just to be sure, they placed a large boulder, believed to be from the Ice Age, that you see over her grave as well. And it worked, as Meg Shelton has remained in her grave ever since. Now my guess is that someone more earthly was responsible for disturbing Meg Shelton's remains, and probably not happy with the fact that a witch was being buried in the churchyard, was returning each night to remove her body from the grave, to play on the belief at the time that witches could rise from their graves at night in the vain hope that Meg Shelton would be buried elsewhere, as it's surprising the lengths some people will go to when they have religious conviction and believe that God is on their side. Now, not surprisingly, a number of spooky legends have sprung up over the centuries regarding Meg Shelton's grave. One of them claimed that if you touch the boulder, you will feel an icy chill, even on a hot day. Another claims that if you circle her grave 3 times whilst chanting her name, a pair of ghostly hands will rise from beneath the boulder to grasp at your legs. Another variation of this legend is that visitors must circle Meg's grave 3 times, then spit on the boulder to keep her trapped in her grave. However, the church in modern times have tried to sanitise and discourage these legends by inventing one of their own, which goes that if you climb onto the boulder and turn around 3 times whilst making a wish, that it will come true. And I'm rather surprised at the church encouraging people to climb up onto Meg's grave, not least because it's disrespectful. So I'm not going to do any of those things, not because I believe in any of them, but because this is someone's final resting place. Anyway, we'll now take a look at Meg Shelton's grave looking back towards the church, as it's rather interesting that they chose this particular spot to bury her. Then I'll give you some closing thoughts on the legend of Meg Shelton and wrap this one up. And this is the view from the back of Meg Shelton's grave. As you can see, just to the right hand side of the footpath there is Meg Shelton's grave and boulder. Now the actual position of Meg Shelton's grave within this churchyard is also rather interesting, because you would have thought that they would have just stuck her in the corner of the churchyard somewhere and forgotten about her, with her being a bit of an undesirable. But the church chose not to do that, and they chose to bury her in a very prominent location. Indeed, the closer that grave plots were to the church back in the day, it was thought that you would be closer to God, and those went for a premium price, so it's interesting that they chose to bury her so close to the church. Now my theory on this is simply that it was a bit of a PR exercise by the church at the time, and that parishioners would have to pass her grave every time that they went to a church service. So it was a little bit of PR to show that good always triumphed over evil, and that's why I think they chose to bury Meg Shelton so close to the church and right at the side of the footpath. So what, Potters, was Meg Shelton a witch? Well, we'll probably never know, but my guess is that she had no more supernatural powers than you and I. And at best she probably had an understanding of herbal and natural remedies. But the fact that she was old and lived alone in an isolated cottage, and was probably disfigured due to the smallpox disease which was ravaging the country at the time, made her an easy target for the accusation of witchcraft. And 30 years after the death of Meg Shelton, an Act of Parliament would be passed in 1735, making it a crime punishable up to a year in prison to accuse someone of witchcraft or claim that they had supernatural powers. And whilst this act alone didn't legalise witchcraft, as decriminalisation only came as late as 1951, believe it or not, with the last woman to be convicted of witchcraft in 1944, it did bring an end to the frivolous witch hunts based off flimsy evidence, and in some cases accusations born simply out of spite that had unwittingly been started by King James I almost a century earlier. So rest in peace, Meg Shelton, and be content that the names of those who tormented you in life have been lost to history, and that they now lie forgotten probably in this very churchyard, whilst 300 years later people are still speaking your name and visiting your grave. Right then, I'll whip the camera around now and I'll wrap this one up, I think. Alrighty folks, well sadly that brings us to the end of today's little adventure. I hope you've enjoyed today's little video from Woodplumpton and taking a look at the Woodplumpton Witch's grave of Meg Shelton in St Anne's Churchyard. Certainly an interesting story and a very unusual burial. But that'll do it for today. I'm going to jump back on the motorway in a moment and head off back home to edit up this video, ready for your edification as always. So, until the next time, happy Halloween and bye-bye for now.